Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. I'm Dan Liebenson, and I'm here with B'nai Lappi. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how you doing?
I'm good, and we should note that we're here 15 minutes early. So if we remember, maybe at the hour, we should let people know who are joining at the hour that we started 15 minutes early, and they can go back and watch the first 15 minutes later if they need to. But we had a scheduling issue, so we're going to start 15 minutes early and end 15 minutes early today. Um, I'll just note that, for people listening much later on the podcast version of this, which one day we'll get actually out, speedily in our day. Just to note where we are in history, there's a Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, whose hearings are happening these days. And so some of that stuff is on our mind. I put aside the politics of whether she should be having confirmation hearings at this time or not, but just the fact of having Supreme Court confirmation hearings, a lot of these kind of legal principles and ideas are in the air. And there have been interesting conversations between members of the Judiciary Committee, many of whom are lawyers, and Amy Coney Barrett about things that touch on what we talk about here in terms of different ways of interpreting an original text. So there's a lot on our minds. You want to say anything about that before we jump
Just
into
that I've been
today's text?
screaming at the TV a lot
Uh-huh.
because I love the way Jewish jurisprudence works, or the way I see it working in the Talmud. And I recognize that there are corners of the Jewish world that have closed that approach down and said, yeah, at best. Yeah, they did that, but we shouldn't do that.
Uh-huh.
They were closer to Moses and God at Mount Sinai. This is the Yeridat Hadorot, the diminution of the generations approach. Yeah, they were radical, but we're like donkeys compared to them, and we shouldn't be that. I know there are corners of the world who say that. But generally speaking, that isn't how Jewish law works. So it's really hard for me to empathize. And I know you're much more charitable than me, but it's really hard for me to understand how someone can really believe that this is, originalism or textualism is a good way to do law. But okay, we should probably leave that aside. It also occurs to me that no matter what text we choose, it always feels like it's resonating with what's going on in the world.
Uh-huh.
And at first I thought that's what a great coincidence, but probably, in a world which is in a crash and in the process of being rebuilt in a lot of ways, we shouldn't be surprised
Uh-huh.
that what's going on in life is also reflected in, because this document, the Talmud, comes out of the mid and post crash period when the rabbis are trying to remake the Jewish world.
Yeah. And and it's interesting because it'll I suppose raise questions about, but there are questions about whether a doctrine like originalism, for example, and Amy Coney Barrett supports a very particular kind of originalism. It's there's all kinds of originalism, actually. But she supports, and Justice Scalia supported, this particular kind of originalism that kind of tries to say that it's only the meaning, more or less the meaning to the reader at the original time. That's the important thing. It's not the original intent of the authors. It's the original, what they call the original public meaning, the what a reader might have made of this text when it was written. And I wonder too if there are times in the development of a society where that kind of reading actually is okay, like makes more sense for whatever reason, it's more stable, versus a time that is not the right time for that kind of interpretation. Meaning that I think a lot of times the advocates for a particular approach, whether that's original public meaning or textualism, or a more progressive oriented point of view, that they kind of assert that this is always the way that the Constitution should be read. And that's an open question too. I mean, maybe there are times when this way of reading makes more sense, and other times that doesn't accord very much with a very polarized political environment. where, there's this desire to lock down, this is what we do and this is what they do, and anything that they do is something can't be what we do, and I wonder, I mean, because I do see like there's some way in which it makes some degree of sense to say that when we legislate or when we make a constitution, that's a big thing, particularly a constitution, because it's not just passing a law. It's it's a super majority. There's all kinds of and that's not done lately. And so there's an argument that makes some degree of sense that says, well, when that happens, we should take the words very, very seriously, because that is the best way. Maybe it's like Churchill said about democracy, it's the worst way except for all the others, but that's the best way that we have to kind of understand what does this mean. And that if people are afraid that every time we amend the Constitution that, down the road people can take it anywhere, then maybe that's going to make them more reluctant to amend the Constitution. And then we won't get the things that we need today met. So that the idea that we're going to try to stick close to the words gives people some degree of confidence that it's okay to expand rights without fear that they're going to be expanded into some place that I'm afraid of. But there's all kinds of arguments that one could make. They're not really, they're not my preferred arguments, but it's interesting to see that played out. And what I was thinking about so much is just how, like you were just saying, like how different that feels from what we've been exploring in the Talmud, where there's so much license taken with the words of the Torah, that it's almost like the opposite of originalism. And in fact, we have this Shalach story where the original author actually arrives and says, that's not what I meant, and they say, we don't have to listen to you. So it really couldn't be much more different based on that story.
And the original author not only is not listened to, but seems to approve of having been not listened to, which is really the point of that story. Yeah.
And he's not only not listened to, but he's not listened to using his own words against him in a way, right? And there's all kinds of layers upon layer. And I think that these things could seem, abstruse and like Jewish, like meaning, kind of limited to this Jewish sphere. But I think that a lot of what we've been talking about over the last few months here is directly applicable. And actually I was kind of, watching the hearings just, kind of somewhat in a rage, like I didn't, but every once in a while there would be a little conversation where I was like, oh, that reminds me of what we talked about. And that actually, it's been interesting.
Yeah. The text we're going to start today, I love that we're doing it right now, because it is the absolute opposite of Amy Coney Barrett's approach. And I think it's just a fabulous case study in the Jewish approach. And I know there is not one Jewish approach, but I would argue that there has been for at least 1,500 years, a predominant normative Jewish approach, which I would call traditionally radical. And it's very, very different. And in this text, which I think will probably take a couple of weeks to cover, we see how it works. And as almost always, there's a wink in it. And the question is always, I think, has that wink been successful? Or have we lost track of the wink and then opened ourselves up to the misinterpretation of this radical approach for an originalist approach? Because we're going to see that the wink is like, that's what it always meant. So it's like an originalist claim on a radical anti-originalist approach. Anyway, we'll flesh it out as we get there.
Well, there's one piece that I think is also just to point out is like, I'm thinking about, for example, like there's a joke, maybe this occurred to me just because you said a wink, but like there's sort of a joke among law students that I want to be a Third Amendment lawyer, when I grow up. And the Third Amendment is the one that says that the government can't house soldiers in your home in a time of peace, right? And the joke of it is that like, that's never been an issue. Like that's just not that's not a live issue. Like that's just not. There are no Third Amendment cases going on, and there's First Amendment that's freedom of speech, religion. Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. The Fourth Amendment is search and seizures. Fifth Amendment due process. There's all the other amendments are very much vigorously enforced. The Third Amendment is kind of like a big nothing. Now, but obviously it was important when it was passed. Like it had to do with a particular situation that was going on. But it also raises that question that we've been talking about here and there of penumbras and emanations. This idea that the Third Amendment is about quartering troops in a person's home in a time of peace, but really that's not what it's about. Like what it's about is the sanctity of the home, right? I mean, it's about the right. There you could argue that it's about much deeper values than that, and you could argue that actually the much deeper values is what the Constitution is trying to, or what the first 10 amendments are trying to solidify, and they did it by giving kind of case studies of the things that were most live for them at that time. Does that mean that if there are new, different ways that the government is encroaching on the sanctity of our home, or that we have to wait and do another amendment, which has become politically basically unfeasible today? Or does that mean that there's a way of understanding these words beyond the words? And that's the live question that's going on. And it cuts both ways. I mean, there are ways in which either whatever interpretive toolbox you use, it can lead to progressive results and it can lead to conservative results. So one of the things that I thought Amy Coney Barrett talked about that was interesting is that it's important to have like the process of how you arrive at your decisions is as important as the decisions themselves. And that's what we've been talking about here for so long. Why what we think is really going on in the Talmud is that it's kind of showing their work, and fundamentally sort of showing what is this really about. And I think that this text has some of that in it. And I wanted to just focus on that because, ultimately, I think this text that we're about to look at has to do with, when can a person who is pregnant or ill not have to fast on Yom Kippur? But that's not really what it's about. In other words, that's not what you ultimately think it's about, and that's not where and the question at the end of the day, the originalism question is, if we're originalists, then that is what it's about. And if we're not originalists, then the question is how much not originalist are we, right? How far are we willing to take it? But originalism becomes a hard thing to argue for when it becomes so limiting that it's like, well, if that's all it was about, then why did we waste the pages on it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's so obvious to me when we're speaking of Talmud. The Talmud is never about the specific surface level case that it's about. It's a paradigmatic case to surface principles that you can use, just like any law textbook.
Right.
I don't know.
But the other piece, it's not only the question of the textbook, it's also a question of the law itself, in the sense that I think that my understanding of the Constitution, I think it's the 10th Amendment, maybe it's the 9th, the one that says that that basically nothing that's written here should limit the other rights that we have, as human beings. And so the question is like, what is the job of law? Is it to define the only rights that we have? Or is it to try to say that there's a way in which we believe that human beings ought to be in relationship to their government and to other forces that are at play, and that we actually have a set of values there, and we have to tease out what those values are. In America, it might be that people are maximally free unless the government chooses to restrict their liberty. And then you would say that if there is a freedom that is in the Constitution, such as you're free to not have troops quartered in your home during a time of peace, that doesn't mean that that's the only freedom that you have about your home. That just, right, that you have all freedoms in your home except for the ones that the government has specifically restricted. And so it's just, and this is a big one because that was on our mind. So we're going to call it out in the Constitution. There might be other values. And here, I think in this text, we want to tease out, what are those values that Judaism is fundamentally saying is like, this is the right of human, this is the rights that a human being has in their life. And are we, is what's in the Talmud, what's in the Torah, should that be seen as the defining of the limited number of rights that a person has, and anything other than that, you're at the whim of God or rabbis or whoever it might be? Or is it quite the opposite, that human beings are sort of, naturally and totally created in the image of God, and therefore fully empowered and free and to be trusted, and whatever adjectives you want to use, and only really you should only understand the limitations that are put in to be the only limitations. And that's a fundamentally the way that you look at law, as that it's about a world in which people are maximally free, except for when the law restricts their freedom, or a world in which people are maximally under the jurisdiction of some other force, except for the freedoms that we give them. That's a fundamentally two different valid views of the way that you might see, how human nature and law work together. And ultimately you want to tease out which does your system believe in. And I think that one of the mistakes that I think a lot of people have about what we might call a very orthodox or very traditional, whatever words, adjectives people want to use, is this notion that people are mostly restricted in Judaism. That like their only freedoms that we have are where it's, as opposed to, I think, quite the opposite, which is that people are maximally,
That's
free.
really interesting. I wonder if the rabbinic revolution and the innovation of the concept of svara was the moment of shift between the biblical orientation of people are maximally restricted unless to people are maximally free, because every human being has that potential to possess svara with enough gamirna, right? Enough learning and being steeped in the values and principles and texts of the tradition. You're recognized to be morally equipped enough to even overturn Torah. And that seems to be the shift. Maybe that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, that sounds very plausible and right. And then the question might be, if we're in the midst of another shift, what would that shift be? Is it even a more radical version of what you just said? Or, I mean, that we don't have to answer. Okay,
Yep.
so should we jump into the text? Do you want to
Yeah,
just read
let's.
it, or do you want to set it up at all? Or
Okay, so setting it up, we're actually backing up a few pages from where we've been, and we have been for the last couple of weeks on the punchline, really, the basic takeaway that the value of life is of paramount concern, and life should take precedence even over the observance of anything in the Torah, with 3 exceptions. And that having been a radical innovation, that we've imputed to ourselves the ability to overturn Torah, to imagine that God actually wanted us to violate God's laws in order to preserve our life, to prevent risk of death. Okay, physical or emotional. So we're backing up to a case that is being discussed on the way to that conclusion. And so I think that's where we're going to jump in today.
okay, great. So,
and I guess I'll also add that we're jumping back in time as well to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is this document that was a very brief sort of Torah 2.0 that was edited together in the year 220 from traditions, the oral traditions that had arisen and kind of taken hold in the previous probably 300 or so years. So we're going back in time now to the Mishnah. This is an early and very, very authoritative like Torah authoritative. In fact, the word Mishnah means basically 2.0. It's Torah 2.0. So it's important to know we're going back in time, because over the next 2 weeks, we're going to take this early tradition and see where the rabbis, moving forward chronologically again, took it. Okay,
and we are in the tractate of Yoma, page 82a, and technically that is a tractate that's centered on Yom Kippur, and this actually is about Yom Kippur. Again, in its initial presentation, it's about Yom Kippur. It's ultimately about more than that.
Yep, exactly.
So the Mishnah says, with regard to a pregnant woman who smelled food and was overcome by a craving to eat it, one feeds her until she recovers.
Okay, there's so much in that. So first of all, traditionally, and for sure in the era of the Mishnah, the only person who could be pregnant was a woman. That's actually not true anymore. So I want to recognize that the word ubara, the pregnant person, is in the female, but moving forward, I'm going to call this a pregnant person because people who identify as male can be pregnant. Okay, fine. So a pregnant person that is overcome with the smell of food, and Rashi here says it's not the woman herself that has smelled the food and gotten this sort of strong appetite or desire to eat it. It's the embryo. The embryo has smelled it, and it's the embryo that kind of has this need to eat. And if the embryo doesn't eat, both the embryo's life or the fetus's life and the woman's life will be in danger. That's the premise. That isn't.
How would we make a distinction between the woman wants it and the embryo wants it? Like, is that he's just saying that the reason the woman wants it is because the embryo wants it. Really,
that's right. And I suspect so Rashi is bringing down this tradition in the 11th century. I suspect that there's some apologetics going on here. In other words, there's an attempt to shore up the legitimacy and the criticalness of the need of this pregnant person. It's not just a whim. It's not just, sit down, you're going to be fine. They want to say, no, this is a life or death issue. And so they're saying, no, it's not in her control, and there's a danger to the fetus. So all of that is sort of laid onto what the surface text says, which is simply that she has smelled food.
Yeah, no, that's just interesting. I think maybe we'll come back to that, only in that I like what you're saying about the apologetic nature of it. It's like because it feels like it's a comment that could come out of an environment like, first of all, a woman, is the woman really important? And second of all, what, she just smelled food? It's like, why is that doesn't, and it's like, okay, well, this is like a one particular case, but it doesn't, some way of kind of almost being dismissive over this. And so for whatever reason, if you're trying to shore it up, you have to say, well, it's not really the woman, it's the embryo.
Right. And it's not just, I feel like it, it's, I need to, or else I'm going to die. And by the way, let's remember that the issue of fasting on Yom Kippur is an issue of karet. Karet means divine extirpation. It's divine capital punishment. In other words, eating on Yom Kippur in the halachic system is understood to be punishable by having your soul cut off. And the rabbis disagree. There's a debate over, does that mean you die early? God forbid. Does that mean when you die, something else happens? But it's really bad. Let's just say it's the worst thing. It's in the category of the worst things you can do. So it's a big deal that they are saying it's okay, you can eat. Right?
Okay.
And in fact, that's what they're saying. They're saying give her whatever she wants to eat until her sort of soul returns to her, until the fetus has calmed down, her desire has gone away. That's the priority. Don't worry about the prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur. Okay.
So that's case number one.
Right.
Case number two, if a person is ill and requires food due to potential danger, one feeds him according to the advice of medical experts, or it just says experts, who determine that he indeed requires food. And if there are no experts there, one feeds him according to his own instructions until he says enough, until he says he's had enough.
Great. Okay, so this is the second case, and the second case is about a sick person. And I think the presumption is the sick person is saying or is understood to be in need of food on Yom Kippur, and or else that person is going to be in danger. And the text says, if experts, maybe doctors, say, yeah, he needs to eat, he can eat and doesn't suffer that horrible consequence of karet, divine extirpation. But we need these experts to be the ones making the call.
Mm-hmm.
If there are no experts available, and only in that case, we're gonna rely on that person's own testimony about themselves and believe that and let them make the call, which is a pretty bold move.
Yeah, because like you say, the consequences that you are eating on Yom Kippur when you, in sort of the Platonic idea, like shouldn't have eaten on Yom Kippur. So, meaning if you make a mistake, you think that you need food, but you actually don't. The result is that you've just eaten on Yom Kippur, which is, like you said, one of the worst things that you could do.
Exactly. The sick person themselves is an interested party here. So you'd be even more inclined not to trust, in a certain sense, their own testimony. It reminds me of another radical move the rabbis make over in Sanhedrin Yivamot. Yivamot. And the rabbis say, a woman who's, okay, generally speaking, a woman who is married to a man in this heteronormative context is up a creek if this man dies with no witnesses, because she can't be declared a widow, nor is she declared, nor does she have a man there to be with her. She can't remarry. And the rabbis eventually say, we are going to allow her to testify on her own behalf, saying, my husband has died, even without two witnesses, even though she's a woman. It's a very bold move. This is a similar kind of bold move to believe the interested party when the consequences are really great and the law that's being overturned is enormous. Okay.
By the way, one thing that I just want to, wait, did you have more on that?
No, that was it.
Oh, because I just wanted to point out one other thing about like our questions about originalism and that kind of thing, which is that there are actually two originalist moments that we might want to look at here, because one is the Torah and one is the Mishnah. We've just read the Mishnah, and then we're going to read the Gemara, which is, a few hundred years later, is going to take this Mishnah and do some stuff with it. But I think it's worth at least pointing out a little bit that the Mishnah is doing something to the Torah, which is, that the Torah, it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you should fast on Yom Kippur. It says that you should torture your soul, however you want to translate that exactly, which at some point became understood to include fasting. It also included other things. And okay, so it did, but like that, the Torah, the original text does not say fasting, and I'm pretty sure that it doesn't. That there's not like an understanding that what torture your soul meant in the ancient world was fasting. I think that that's not like an original public meaning claim that that's meant fasting. Like if they said fasting, they said fasting. Like in the book of Isaiah where he is yelling about you fast and then you oppress the poor and I hate your fast. It doesn't say I hate your soul torturings. It says I hate your fasts, because they knew how to say fast when they wanted to say fast. And so it's not at all clear that the original meaning of the Torah is fasting. So the Mishnah itself is either itself giving meaning to that and saying that means fasting, or is at least it's kind of ratifying what had become by that point an accepted social meaning of torture your soul to be fasting. And now it's putting it into writing, and they're saying, well, we're not legislating. It's meant fasting for a few hundred years, which it may well have. So we don't really know, but it's just worth looking at how the Mishnah is not necessarily like which one is the Constitution, which one is the it's like the Voting Rights Act, for example, right, was a the Constitution in the 14th 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, they say that Congress shall have the power to enact this provision of equality of citizens through proper legislation. And so the Voting Rights Act is a law that's not part of the Constitution, but it kind of draws its strength from the fact that the Constitution specifically says that Congress should legislate on this issue. So it's a little bit of a stronger version of the law. And you could kind of say, like, that's like the Mishnah, and the Torah is like the Constitution, and we're about to interpret the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act, which itself is kind of an interpretation of the Constitution. That's part of what's going on here as well.
That's really interesting. That sounds right. And it's an interesting and non-obvious move that they would take a new innovation like fasting or a new understanding and retroject it into the Torah. They'd be able to play with it a lot more if they didn't, but they don't do that. They retroject it into the Torah, I guess, I suppose, because they wanted to really have this sense of Torahitic authority. But later they're in a corner, like here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They find themselves suffering from the fact that they've done that, and they realize, you know what? Sometimes that's going to get us in trouble, but in those times we can actually undo the door a little bit and say, in this circumstance, it's okay, even though we're doing this radical thing of undoing a Torahitic law, which they made a Torahitic law in the first place.
Right. And that happens all the time in law. It's like, and it's kind of appropriate. I mean, like, in the sense that oftentimes what'll happen is that there's like some 19th century case interpreting the Constitution, and then there's stare decisis. We talked a lot about that with Amy Coney Barrett. This idea that cases that have been in force for a long time should stand because the public has sort of come to rely on that as what the Constitution means, and you can't just keep willy-nilly every 10 years, changing what the meaning of the Constitution is. So the stare decisis is this idea that, even if it's kind of wrong or we think it's wrong, but it's been decided 100 years ago, probably it should remain as, and then what do you do? Because we've now, like you said, boxed ourselves in by interpreting the Constitution in a particular way, and now we're stuck with it. So what do? You limit that case, and you say, oh yeah, but that was only a case about this particular limited, example. That was about voting, but here we're talking about housing, so that doesn't apply. And that's what happens all the time in law. You could say it's legitimate, illegitimate, but that's that's how you do it. It's like you one option is to go back and say, we're overturning the case, we were wrong 100 years ago. And that happens sometimes when it's important enough, or you can't limit the case enough, and you say, well, that was wrongly decided. Thank God, for example, that the Dred Scott case was actually overruled, right, by Brown versus Board of Education, and like that. So that should happen. But a lot of times, for various reasons, they don't want to overrule that case from 100 years ago. And so instead, they limit its application. And if you can limit its application to a case that doesn't exist anymore, right? Like, well, that case applied to, horse-drawn carriages. Well, we don't really transport ourselves in horse-drawn carriages anymore. So basically, you've overruled that case without overruling it, right? And so there are all kinds of moves like that are just standard legal moves.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay,
right.
so it looks like we have just a simple case of a pregnant person and a second case, sick person. Two cases. Okay, so we're going to focus on the case of the sick person. And just to recap, the Mishnah says that if a sick person needs to eat on Yom Kippur, experts need to give permission for that sick person to eat. Only in the case where there are no experts present do we rely on that sick person's testimony about themselves, but we do. And in that case, and we allow them to eat until they say, I've had enough. Okay, great. Hard return, for those of our listeners who remember typewriters, new paragraph. Now we're going to move ahead 100 years. Okay, so now we're into the era of the Amoraim, and who, generally speaking, according to the rules of the Jewish jurisprudential game, cannot overturn the Mishnah or any teachings of the Mishnaic era. But the open joke is, yeah, that never happens. And it always happens. The
Right.
Talmud is basically a record of that happening over and over and over and over. Okay, so now we have a rabbi, Rabbi Yanai, who's going to come. He's a 3rd century, first generation Amora, and we're going to see what he says. And by the way, moving from Mishnah to Gemara, we have to remember the Gemara is doing a whole bunch of things that the Mishnah generally isn't. It's entertaining new cases that the Mishnah seemed to be silent on. It's asking for sources. It's asking for authors. Well, who said that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The teachings we just heard have no stated attribution. We don't know whose opinion that was. It resolves conflicts or apparent conflicts between the Mishnah and the Torah and this Mishnah and another Mishnah and so on. Okay, so we're going to see, or there's going to be a fleshing out of, but what if? That's basically case law. So we're in the what if category now.
Yeah, and I loved what you said about the hard return of the typewriter, because that's like a great example. Like if we can limit this case to typewriters, then it's fine because we all use computers now. So then we don't have to worry about it. And I think we're going to see like versions of those moves here, which is why I'm just reinforcing it.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Here comes Rabbi Yanai.
Okay, so here comes Rabbi Yanai. It was taught in the Mishnah. If a person is ill and requires food due to potential danger, one feeds him according to the advice of experts. Rabbi Yanai said, if an ill person says he needs to eat and a doctor says he does not need to eat, one listens to the ill person.
Great, let's stop there.
Okay.
Okay, so now the new case that Rabbi Yanai is saying is the sick person says, I really need to eat. If I continue my fast as I'm required to do, I think I'll die or it's going to endanger my life. And there is an expert present, a doctor, and the doctor says, you're fine. I've examined you. You can continue with your fast, just like the Torah says, quote unquote, you should do. So
Right.
you can't eat. I rule that you're not allowed to eat. You should continue your fast.
Right.
And Rabbi Yanai says, we listen to the sick person over the authority, over the doctor, and we let the sick person eat.
Which I want to show this text again, because like I want to say, like, it's really the originalist take on this text would be not that, right? I mean, the originalist take on this text
on the Mishnah. On the Mishnah.
Yeah, on the right. Mishnah, yeah. Like if I'm sitting here and like I'm a normal person and I'm reading this Mishnah, it says if an ill person requires food, one feeds him according to the advice of experts. And if there are no experts there, one feeds him according to his own instructions until he says enough. So the straightforward reading of this is if there's an expert there, we listen to the expert. That's right. Isn't that what it says, right? I mean,
that's exactly what it says. And in fact, the Gemara, that the editor is going to create a voice in the Gemara saying, wait a minute, what are you doing, Rabbi Yanai? The Mishnah says something, how can you... So stay tuned. Stay tuned. The Mishnah is actually going to articulate that very objection. Okay, but we're not quite there yet. So here comes the editor now piping up before articulating the contradiction between Rabbi Yanai and our Mishnah. The editor pipes up and says, what's the reason? Why are we listening to the sick person when there's an expert present and the expert says you don't need to eat and the sick person says you do need to eat? This question isn't, hey, wait a minute, how can you overturn or contradict a Mishnah? That challenge is going to come later. This is simply why are we listening to a sick person over doctors? Doctors are experts.
Right.
Shouldn't their view sort of win the day? Shouldn't you listen to your doctor? And here comes the answer.
Okay, so the answer is quoting the book of Proverbs for a statement, the heart knows the bitterness of its soul.
Right. Lev yodea marat nafsho. The heart knows the bitterness of its own soul. Okay, in other words, the individual knows best what their internal reality is. I know better than an expert what my experience is, what I'm feeling, what I need, who I am. I think we should put a sticky here, but eventually I'd love to come back and ask what might be the implications of this idea that the individual knows best, the individual knows better than experts. In this case, whether they need to eat, but maybe about lots of other things. I think we're seeing the beginning of a deep principle, not just a statement about a sick person and their ability to know if they need to eat, right? This is an idea that I think is setting out one of those values in the new rabbinic system of what we believe about people. We believe that people know themselves best and, what's implied, have the ultimate authority about their own lives.
Right.
In some profound way.
Right. And if you want to limit that freedom, you're going to have to work really hard to do it, because if our sort of foundational principle is going to be people know themselves best and know their own needs best, and we should trust them, and trust, not only is it a person knows their needs best, but it's also and we're going to assume that people are motivated by true good motives and they're not going to lie, right? And so we're going to take those two things together and say, if a person says that they need something, then they need it and they should have it. And if you don't want that to be, you're going to have to work really hard to limit that freedom, because we're going to interpret every piece of legislation that you ever do that's contrary to that into its narrowest possible interpretation to try to maintain that maximal freedom. So that becomes real. And that's what I was trying to say earlier about, like, if we understand, as the, again, 9th or 10th Amendment does, that America in theory recognizes people to be maximally free and less limited by law, then we're going to come out with a different point of view than if we understand people to be minimally free unless the law grants them the right.
Okay, you just gave me an idea about what the very next word of the text means, because this next word has always puzzled me. Okay, so let's look at where the text goes next.
Okay, I just want to make one other quick comment, and we can come back to it. But there's two things. One is the principle that they're declaring, right? People should be maximally free. But the other is the source where they're citing. Where do they get that? Which is in the book of Proverbs, which we can look at later if you want. We don't have to take the time, but it's like, it doesn't really mean that. I mean, that's not what the book of Proverbs is trying to say. Again, most likely, if you read in context, it kind of means that, like, it's like some version of, like, no man is an island, but it's like every man is an island. It's like everybody is like, we're all on our own in the world. It's like you don't know me, you don't know me, you don't know my suffering, you don't know my happiness. Like, that's what's going on here. It's kind of a nihilistic, right. Kind of like, it's similar to stuff in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's like kind of a bummer of a, like, we're just out here alone, right? And so I don't, I mean, I don't make anything of that really one way or the other. I just think it's like to point it out that for some reason they often, not always, feel that they want to, like, find some source in Bible to ground this in. This isn't even in the Torah, it's in somewhere else in the Bible. And what we've talked about many times is like the wink. It's like, if you actually go and read that, you're really going to see that this is, if our claim is that we're getting this idea from the Torah or from the Bible, like, that's a big wink. If you want to say, like, we get this idea from a more fundamental understanding of maybe what the Bible is all saying in the big picture of what we really believe a human being is, and then we're kind of using this source to kind of reinforce, okay, like, then we can talk about it. But it's another one of those sources that's kind of like taken out of context big time.
Absolutely. And you're right. The fact that it's in Proverbs, it's like, you had to dig that far to get something. Typically, if a source is not in one of the 5 books of the Torah, in the Chumash, it's recognized to be a pretty weak source.
And particularly Proverbs. It's one of those, I always think of Proverbs as like, there's that list in Hamlet of all the like little, neither a borrower nor a lender be, et cetera, et cetera. And it's actually meant to be a joke. Like it's meant to be in Hamlet. It's this kind of doddering old man, kind of sending his son off with all this like list of cliches. And I actually think like it's not unclear that Proverbs doesn't kind of play that role in the Bible. Like it is important. There's good stuff in there.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of weird stuff. So it's kind of like Proverbs.
I know, it's like, as God taught in the book of Jewish fairy tales, it reminds me of that source from Esther in the text we learned. It was
Right.
one of our first texts about the God holding the mountain.
Yeah, right.
And how do we know that actually the covenant really isn't for all? Because it said in the Flintstones. Okay.
Right.
It said in this story that we don't even believe happened. Okay, fine.
Okay, you wanted to go to the next word.
Okay, so now the editor is coming in. We always know the editor is jumping in when two things happen. One, the language switches to Aramaic and there's no attribution.
Mhm.
So that's our clue that the voice, this isn't a flat document. It's a document with different historical layers and different voices, and in order to create a kind of fake conversation. And the editor is now jumping in, way later, many hundreds of years later, who's piecing this whole thing together. And the editor says, Pshita, that's obvious. And this has always puzzled me, because it's not actually obvious. I don't think it's obvious that you would listen to the individual. And the fact that the editor is saying that's obvious, maybe, here's what you were making me think. Maybe it's the editor saying this is a deep principle, not just a statement about the sick person. The deep principle that an individual knows themselves best and therefore is authorized to make decisions over and above what external authorities say about them, maybe in lots of ways, is obvious. So maybe that's a hint that this is a broad principle and not just a narrow statement about a sick person in Yom Kippur.
And it kind of feels, it just hearing you say that, it feels like it's telling us something about the society in which they are living before the Gemara, before this conversation. And like you say, this is an early, this is brought up by an early voice, but the editor is a late voice, but they're saying kind of like, so I guess you could say it's about the Jewish society as they understand the society that they've built, and or the kind of larger world society, the Persian society in which they live, where they're saying, of course, it's like things that we would say about what it is to be an American. Well, of course, a person has fundamental self-determination as a, that's a principle that we all know in our life, so why are we even, like that's just a basic building block of the society that we live in. So it's not even a principle, like I'm trying to say, it's not even a principle that they're declaring as a larger principle. It's like they're saying, of course, that's part of, that's an assumption, a given about a person in our world today. That's been true for hundreds of years, something like that.
And now you're reminding me of that idea, that pikuach nefesh, the idea that, of course, you're going to drive to the hospital on Shabbos if someone is, having a baby or whatever. Of course, that just seems like a given. So maybe to the editor, this idea that this was a principle about the autonomy of an individual had already gained legs.
Right.
And he really is sincerely saying that, we know that to be true.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, what the example, one example that I would think of as like, what would this feel like today, is if somehow we were engaged in some Jewish conversation, and somebody said like, we should something where we should give women some equal position or whatever. We should listen to the
Yeah.
testimony of a female witness, and said, because a woman is a person, as we know from this verse, they created Adam and Eve both in God's image. And somebody's like, of course a woman's a person. I wasn't even thinking that she wasn't. Like, that question didn't even occur to me. Like, it's just something so bizarre that you've even raised this, because like of course we know that, and yet we also know that hundreds and hundreds of years ago that wasn't true in like the biblical period. But I mean, like, but we've been past that for hundreds of years. So why are you bringing this up now? It feels like that's.
I love that. And why you're bringing this up now, I wonder, I don't know if I'm going in the wrong direction or different direction here, but maybe what the Stama is saying here is, why would I even need a verse? Why do you even need to give me a verse to teach me that this is, of course. I think that maybe that's what the Peshitta is doing here. She's just saying, that's it. Yeah. I don't need a verse. I know that. Yeah. That's what we all believe.
Yeah, like I don't need the verse, male and female, God created them, to know that a woman is a person today. Like, it's just like, I don't need that verse. That we've been living in a world in which women have been a full person, not necessarily that they've had full rights, but I mean the understanding that a woman is a person, not property, for example, right? We've known that for, our world has accepted that. I mean, our Western world's accepted that for hundreds of years. We don't need a verse from the Bible to reinforce that at this point. Yeah.
Okay, great. I love that. So now let's see what, again, the editor is inserting as the answer to that challenge. Why would I even need a verse to know this? Of course we know this. Here comes the answer to that question.
Okay, so the editor says it's obvious that a person knows their own needs better than anyone else. And so the Gemara says, but we have to say it lest you say that the doctor is more certain because he's had more experience. Therefore, the verse teaches us that even so, even though the doctor does have more experience, the ill person knows his own suffering better than anyone else.
Oh, I see that translation kind of agrees with this idea that the claim, this is obvious, is really pointing to, why do we need a verse to know this thing that's obvious? Okay, and so the answer is, well, you might have erroneously believed that in a case like this, and maybe by extension other cases, the authority has had more experience of this illness and knows, for example, that the hunger pains aren't really hunger pains. It's just some sort of contraction of the stomach, and the patient can't, know that, and that we should believe the doctor.
Right.
But no, just to be sure that you don't go there in your mind and say, yeah, generally, we do believe the person, but if there are doctors, we should believe doctors because they're so. No, don't even go there. And right.
I worry about where this is going a little bit in terms of trusting doctors, but I know it's okay in the end, but that's that's sadly one of those issues today in our world that's not pshita, obvious. Okay. So even if the doctor says, oh, I've seen this case a million times, somebody says they have aches and pains in their lower back and food doesn't help and you don't need it and you'll be fine. No, the person says, no, but I need it. They get it.
Exactly. The person's own experience overrides the doctor's evaluation of what they actually need. Okay.
Yep.
Great.
And just as a reminder, this continues to be contrary to the plain reading of the Mishnah.
That's right.
We've gone through all these permutations, but at the end of the day, we still have not resolved the fact that this appears to be the opposite of what the Mishnah says.
Exactly. And the Gemara hasn't yet even articulated that Rabbi Yanai is in conflict with the Mishnah, but we're going to get there.
Okay. So moving on.
Yes. Now we have a second case that Rabbi Yanai is going to rule on.
Okay, so in the opposite case, if a doctor says that the person needs food, but the ill person himself says he does not need to eat, one listens to the doctor.
Good, let's stop there.
Okay.
Okay, so again, the doctor says you really need to eat. If you don't eat, you're going to be in trouble. I know it's Yom Kippur, but you got to eat. The patient says, no, I'm fine. I really want to fast. I can do it. I want to keep my fast. You know, this reminds me of my grandmother. When 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 I was a kid, she she had diabetes, she had all sorts of ailments, and she really wanted to do her fast. And I knew enough of Jewish law to say, Grandma, you don't have to fast. And we'd sit in shul, and I said, Grandma, you really need to eat. You really need to eat. That's what you're supposed to do. Anyway,
Yep.
that's to say nothing. I was just thinking about my grandma.
Yes, well, that's very valid. Um,
Okay.
no,
Okay.
but it's a great case because the point is that there are these people who think like they just either they're afraid, right? What if I make a mistake and maybe God will punish me or whatever the consequence is? But maybe I just don't. Or they just say like I'm going to feel like I'm going to feel bad about myself, or I'm going to feel like I didn't really observe the holiday, or I'm just and I really would like to try to make it through the fast. My kids, do that just because it's like it's an achievement, whatever the reason might be.
Yeah,
But
but more, I think even more commonly, and this is true for my grandma, she didn't know that it was okay for her to eat.
uh-huh, uh-huh,
She really believed that she needed to fast.
uh-huh. But I think even people who do know, they still kind of feel
Yeah,
like, but I should, if I can, I should, and this is like, no. As soon as the doctor shows up and says you shouldn't, you shouldn't.
right. Okay, so it's the patient themselves who now says, I don't need to fast.
Mm-hmm,
Now, if you were just working off of the previous case of Rabbi Yana, you might think we always listen to the patient
mm-hmm,
over and above authorities. But
mm-hmm,
here, Rabbi Yanai is saying, no, we listen to the doctor and make sure the person eats.
mm-hmm.
I don't know, are they going to force feed him? I don't know. I always wondered how that's going to work. But we now realize that, oh, the value isn't ultimately listen to the individual. The value is actually something different because now we're not listening to the individual. And why? The Gemara is going to ask, why aren't we listening to the individual here? I thought from Rabbi Yanai's last statement, his big chiddush, like his big idea was the individual always wins the day. What they say about themselves. No, that actually isn't the big takeaway.
Right.
There's a bigger takeaway.
Okay. So, and we're running out of time for today, but we'll take it a little bit further. So
Okay.
the Gemara says, what is the reason for this? It is because
Sorry, and again, this is why now are we listening to the doctors
right,
who say
right,
you have to eat rather than the individual? Okay.
right, and the answer that the Gemara gives is it's because of confusion. Confusion has taken hold of the ill person on account of his illness, and his judgment is impaired.
Good. In other words, there's the worry, just out of the possibility that the person's illness has caused them to not kind of accurately perceived their body's need. This maybe he's got tunba. They're saying tunba is like this rigidity of the abdomen or something, which seems to camouflage the
Uh-huh.
individual's
Uh-huh.
experience of their own hunger.
Well, it's actually
Okay.
like in COVID-19, there's this I think they call it like silent pneumonia or something, where people think they don't realize that they're not getting enough oxygen, and so that's
That's
why a
not
lot of
true.
people are dying, was because they felt fine, but they actually were not getting oxygen,
That's
and
right.
I don't think they know why that's happening. But yeah, and
Mhm.
the question is, I mean, I guess like, wouldn't the flip side of that be that if you're in the state of confusion and you might be saying, I do need to eat because I'm sick, then we listen to you, even though you might be in the state of confusion. So one possibility is that like, no, Toonba only works in one direction and it only makes you think that you don't need food when you do. It doesn't work in the opposite direction. Or we say, no, we take that risk. I mean, that somehow it could be that you don't actually need the food.
Yeah, I think that's the implication. The implication is we're going to err on the side of feeding you and allowing you to contravene this very serious prohibition even though we know you might be thinking you need food when you don't, because a more prior value is the saving of a life. That making sure we're not risking life. So that's why this person's own testimony about themselves, I don't need to eat, I can keep my fast, isn't listened to, because there's the possibility that their life might be in danger and they don't even realize it. And so that we don't run into that problem, we're not going to listen to them.
Well, and this isn't a question, I'm not sure, but like it could also be that this principle that a person should be trusted to know their own pain is so fundamental that we're going to err on the side that when a person says I'm in pain, we're going to err on the side of trusting him, even though we know it might be the same confusion as the person saying I'm not in pain. Whether or not it results in the saving of a life, what we're saying is that separate and apart from, and it goes together with, that we take really, really seriously this idea that a person is fundamentally the best position to know their own needs, their own pain. So we'll pick that up next week, right? Just to remind folks who joined us late, we started 15 minutes early and we're ending 15 minutes early because of a scheduling issue. So if you came on time and you're disappointed that you've only had 45 minutes, there's an extra 15 minutes to listen to at the beginning so you can rewind.
Exactly. And next week, we're going to begin at the very next word where the Talmud says, "What? Wait a minute. All this is really beautiful, but that's not what the Mishnah said or meant."
Right.
So
right.
we're
and by then, well, I still think we won't have yet. By then there'll be a lot more debating about these things that we'll be able to watch in Congress. All right, Vinay, see you soon. See you next week.
All right. Thanks so much. This was fun.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.